Picture this. There's someone sitting alone in their room long after everyone else has gone to sleep. The lights are off, the phone is face down, and the only sound in the entire space is their own breathing. They're not crying. They're not panicking. They're not spiraling. They're just there. Still, quiet, unbothered. And if you walked in on them, you'd probably think something is wrong, because society has trained you to believe that being alone in silence means emptiness or sadness or some kind of emotional failure. But what if I told you that this person, the one sitting alone in the dark, is more emotionally evolved than almost anyone they know? What if I told you that loners aren't born, they're shaped? And what shaped them wasn't drama, wasn't chaos, wasn't some headline-worthy trauma. It was something far more subtle, something far more common, something that grows in the quiet corners of childhood where nobody pays attention. Stay with me, because once you understand this pattern, you won't be able to unsee it. It starts earlier than you think, not at 15, not at 12, not even at 10. It starts at the exact moment a child realizes that expressing their feelings is pointless. Maybe they tried to show excitement once, ran to tell someone something good, and that someone barely looked up. Maybe they cried because something hurt, and instead of comfort, they got a sigh, a lecture, or worse, silence so thick it felt like rejection wearing a mask of indifference. And the child, confused but desperate to survive emotionally, learns the first rule of becoming a loner. When I feel something, I deal with it alone. Not because they wanted to, because nobody showed them another option. And here's where it gets dark. This child didn't just learn to handle their feelings alone. They learned something deeper, something far more corrosive, that people are unreliable when it matters, that reaching out comes with risks, that vulnerability is a gamble with terrible odds. And the child who learns that lesson doesn't grow up loud. They grow up quiet, not shy, strategic, not antisocial, self-protective. They grow up watching everything, the room, the tone, the micro gestures on someone's face. Because when comfort was unpredictable, their nervous system started scanning for danger long before their brain had the words for it. This is the part people never understand about loners. They think solitude is a preference. They think it's personality. But it's not. It's a skill, a survival adaptation, a carefully built emotional fortress crafted in a childhood where people were physically present but emotionally absent. A childhood where love existed, sure, but support didn't. A childhood where feelings were an inconvenience instead of something to be understood. Loners aren't running away from people. They're running away from the patterns people taught them. And here's the brutal truth that'll punch you in the chest once you accept it. Loners didn't stop trusting because something catastrophic happened. They stopped trusting because nothing happened. No comfort, no validation, no presence, just emptiness dressed as normal life. Picture another moment. A child tries to express disappointment, maybe something small. A friend canceled, a toy broke, a teacher snapped at them. They go to someone, looking for comfort, and that someone responds with irritation, or annoyance, or the worst weapon of all, minimization. And the child learns that their emotions are too heavy for others to carry. So they start carrying everything themselves. This is the origin story of the quiet kid, the mature for their age, the one everyone praised because they never caused problems. But what nobody saw was the cost. Being low maintenance wasn't a personality trait. It was a trauma response. It was a child understanding, far too early, that needing anything from anyone was a guaranteed way to get disappointed. Loners grow up with emotional muscle built from lifting their own pain alone. And what does that create in adulthood? Someone who doesn't complain, someone who observes, someone who gives more than they receive, someone who listens deeply but speaks in half-truths because they learned honesty is a liability, someone who doesn't chase people, not because they don't care, but because they already know how the story ends, someone who disappears quietly, not dramatically, because being unseen feels more natural than being misunderstood. And here's the darkest twist of all. Loners don't hate people. They're not cold, they're not broken, they're not distant by nature, they're distant by training. They give the world the same thing the world gave them, space. People call loners mysterious, but they're not. Their life is an open book with the pages glued shut, and that glue was childhood. You think staying home means they're avoiding life? No. It means they finally found a place where they don't have to shrink for anyone. A place where their presence isn't a burden. A place where the peace they never had as kids finally exists on their terms. And the irony? But loners stopped opening up long before they even knew what the phrase meant. Because when a child learns that being vulnerable gets them ignored, dismissed, or punished, they grow up choosing solitude over connection. Not because they want to be alone, but because alone is the only place they ever felt safe. But here's where the story flips, the part nobody tells you because it makes people uncomfortable. The loner doesn't stay alone because they're broken. They stay alone because somewhere along the way they realize something dangerous, something liberating, something society hopes they never figure out. Solitude is power. Not the cold, cinematic kind, not the dramatic anti-hero kind, the quiet kind, the stable kind, the kind that no one can take away from you once you've tasted it. Because at some point in adulthood, maybe in their 20s, maybe in their 30s, maybe in the middle of an ordinary evening, they discover that being alone doesn't hurt anymore. It heals. It restores. It clarifies. They realize that spending time with the wrong people is 10 times more draining than being alone. They realize that silence doesn't break them. It holds them together. And once someone discovers that, they never go back. Not fully. Not in the way others expect. Think about the average person. Their worth comes from external noise, social approval, group acceptance, being invited, being wanted, being seen. They crumble if they're ignored. They panic if a friend doesn't reply. Their identity depends on how others perceive them. But the loner? Their identity was built in the dark. It was forged in the spaces where nobody clapped for them. Nobody validated them. Nobody stayed long enough to shape who they became. So they shaped it themselves. Their sense of self didn't come from applause. It came from silence. That is what makes them dangerous. Not to people, but to systems built on emotional dependence. Here's something you've probably never realized. Loners are harder to manipulate than anyone else. Why? Because manipulation requires two things: your need for approval and your fear of rejection. But loners don't need approval, and they've been rejected so many times that it stopped scaring them. You can't emotionally control someone who doesn't rely on your presence to feel whole. You can't pressure someone who prefers walking away to fitting in. You can't intimidate someone whose childhood already taught them the worst-case scenario of emotional abandonment. They lived it, survived it, and built a personality around never feeling that helpless again. The loner is not fragile, they're fortified. Picture another moment. A loner is invited to a gathering. Everyone assumes they said no because they're awkward, shy, introverted, or antisocial. But the loner isn't thinking about any of that. They're simply scanning the emotional cost. They ask themselves silently, will this drain me? Will I have to pretend? Will I walk out feeling emptier than when I walked in? If the answer is yes, they decline. Not because they dislike people, but because they finally understand something the rest of the world is terrified to admit. Their peace is worth more than social participation. And here's where the loneliness myth dies. People assume loners suffer from loneliness, but loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of feeling understood. And loners learn too early that being surrounded by people who don't get you is a deeper kind of loneliness than being alone. They didn't escape people to avoid life. They escaped people to avoid the ache of pretending. You know the ache I'm talking about. The smile that doesn't reach your eyes, the laugh that feels forced, the conversations that feel like you're reading from a script instead of speaking from your chest. Loners walked away from that, not because they're weak, but because they're honest. And their honesty shows up in unexpected ways. They don't need constant messaging. They don't need daily reassurance. They don't need attention every time they breathe. They only need authenticity. They're allergic to superficiality in a world built on it. That's why most people misunderstand them. Most relationships are transactional. Give validation, receive validation. Give attention, receive attention. But loners don't play by those rules. They're not impressed by social performances. They're drawn to silence that feels safe, presence that feels real, people who don't force them to shrink or expand unnaturally. They're drawn to energy, not activity. And here's another uncomfortable truth. Loneliness made them emotionally intelligent in ways others never reach. When you grow up navigating emotional landscapes alone, you become a master at reading them. You notice the shift in someone's voice. You sense the tension behind their smile. You feel when energy changes before anyone else does. Loners are observers because observation was their earliest protection. They knew more than they spoke. They felt more than they showed. And that continues into adulthood, shaping them into people who see the world through an unfiltered lens, a lens most people couldn't handle. But for all their strength, here's the part people rarely acknowledge. Loners don't actually want lifelong isolation. What they want is safety, emotional safety, psychological safety. They want connection without fear, closeness without pressure, intimacy without manipulation. They want someone who listens when they speak and notices when they go quiet, but they will never sacrifice their peace to obtain it. That's the difference between a loner and everyone else. Everyone else negotiates their emotional boundaries to keep people close. Loners enforce theirs to keep themselves alive. And here's the paradox. The world admires them, but misunderstands them. People think they're mysterious because they reveal so little. People think they're cold because they protect themselves so well. People think they're unfeeling because they don't overshare. But the truth is, loners feel everything so deeply, so intensely, so overwhelmingly that they had to create distance just to manage the storm. They're not numb. They're flooded. They're not detached. They're cautious. They're not heartless. They're hurt in ways that matured into wisdom. They don't realize opening up for a loner isn't a conversation. It's a risk. A risk they took as a child over and over with nothing to show for it. A risk that taught them the safest place to store their emotions is inside themselves. A risk they'll only take with someone who proves they're not like the rest. And here's the final truth that will either free you or destroy your illusions. Loners didn't choose solitude over people. They chose themselves over abandonment. They chose peace over chaos. They chose truth over performance. They chose depth over noise. And in a world drowning in distraction and artificial connection, choosing yourself is the most radical act of all. If you're a loner, you weren't shaped by weakness. You were shaped by survival. You didn't retreat from the world. You learned to rise above the parts of it that couldn't meet you where you were. And the day you stop apologizing for that is the day you finally become who you were meant to be.